All right, class. So let's review those two different methods. The two methods that we use to solve this design problem, and the way that we're going to solve all of these design and analysis problems are going to be these two cases. So the first one we went over was in terms of P and W, right? It might be an applied force or it might be a distributed force, W. Basically, what you're going to do is assume some sort of value for that, right? Give it some units. Think about this as a constant. You basically want to figure out what each stress is going to be in terms of that P or W. Then you're going to use your free body diagram and your equations of equilibrium to figure out what each of those are in terms of P and W, right? Once you find those internal forces, you can use those to find your stresses. And then you compare those stresses to figure out what your critical part is. Which one's going to fail first based on the highest stress versus the allowed stress. Once you know that, you can go back and use that maximum stress to figure out what P and W are, because you've already found this in terms of P or W. Pretty simple method. But you have to really understand how to calculate those stresses, and sometimes P or W can get kind of confusing because it's a quantity, and sometimes you might guess units like I did, and I guessed kilonewtons, and it was actually newtons. So you have to be pretty clever there and careful. The second method is the assume and check steps method. The assume and check. We don't like to use guess and check because that doesn't make us sound like we're very smart or very careful in our engineering. And it's okay to make assumptions. You just have to go back and check your assumptions. And you might need to iterate if you find your assumptions are wrong. So in this particular case, you guess which one is critical. You are going to assume that one fails first. How do you know? Sometimes you can look at it and go, okay, there's more load over here. I'm going to guess that one. But you have to go back and check. You don't know for sure until you check, right? So you're going to write an assumption. If you do not write an assumption, I'm going to assume that you don't know what you're doing, right? That's very important. That's the part where you assume. You have to write that out. You calculate your internal force basically using that maximum stress or force in that critical part based on the assumption that you just made. That's why you have to write the assumption, right? You're starting to see this a little bit. Then you check your other parts against those maximum values. In this particular case, the example that we just did, we found that we were wrong. CD actually has a higher stress and it fails first. So in this case, we weren't in this first case. We didn't guess right. In this case, we guessed wrong. It means we go back to step 2. And instead of assuming AB fails first, we cross it out and we go CD fails first. And we do basically the same steps to figure our answer. Once you figure that out, you can figure out what your W or your P is using that critical failure case. So let's do a quick comparison of those two things. The two methods, right, we said in terms of P or W and assume and check. The pros of using in terms of P or W is that we don't have to guess and check, right? It's not iterative. You do it once. Downside is there's a lot more algebra. You really have to keep track of what P and W actually represent and what the units are. Sometimes you might guess wrong. You need to go and change your units. You also have to have very, very good understanding of how to interpret the critical or failing part when you get to that point, right? Just because you got a higher 3W or a 2W, you really have to go back to the stress and you have to really understand what's going on there to use the P or W method correctly. The advantage of using the assume or check method is it's simple. It works even with a bad guess, right? We figured out what the maximum forces would be in both of those, assuming they were at maximum stress. We go and you go, okay, one fails, go through the method, right? It's iterative, it's great. It might take 2 tries to solve. It's also something you could easily program, right? I could build a spreadsheet that does that. It's kind of neat if you know how to do that. It's pretty easy to do. So those are the two methods. I just wanted to go a quick overview of those two, make sure that we had a really good understanding because we're going to see more of these problems crop up in our homework and we want to make sure that we're prepared for them.